for their involvement in the January 6th Capitol breach, including 60 suspected of assaulting or impeding police officers. January 6th defendant Tim Hale joins us now to discuss. His felony conviction was vacated after he spent nearly 3 years behind bars for non-violent offenses. Tim, thanks for being with us today. Could you start us out a little bit with your history, with your story? What exactly happened to you 4 years ago today? And even though your sentence has been vacated, why did you spend 3 years, almost 3 years, in jail?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. So I was one of the first people picked up after January 6th. I was smeared as a domestic terrorist and all kinds of things. And basically, I was one of the people who went inside the Capitol, but I wandered around for about 40 minutes. Now, I didn't break down any barriers. I didn't break open the Capitol. I didn't break windows or kick doors open. I didn't fight any cops. But basically, I went to trial, and so I was sentenced to 4 years, of which I had to do 3, thanks to President Trump signing the First Step Act. There are a lot of different details to January 6th, but essentially, we were set up by federal informants. They went hard after me because I fought my case, and I'm still fighting it technically because I still want all the video released. As you indicated, I was just recently vindicated with the vacating of my conviction, but I already served 3 years, so I'm not sure how I get that time back. But this is, of course, all the results of the government prosecuting people without investigating them and then misapplying federal statutes like 18 U.S.C. 1512, which the Supreme Court recently overturned.
Tim, do you feel like you did anything wrong? Was there anything you did on January 6th that you felt like you shouldn't have done? And I think we could have the argument that even if you did something that maybe wasn't appropriate, 4-year sentence, 3 years feels to a lot of people like overcharging. You just said it was nonviolent. You didn't attack law enforcement. All of that sounds like quite a sentence for something that's nonviolent. But is there something that people would say, oh yeah, probably shouldn't have done that on January 6th when they're officially selecting the president?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to lie. When the cops started attacking the crowd, I got a little, I was very angry, and so I used foul language. But at the end of the day, that's not a crime. And the important thing to remember, too, is that the majority of people who supposedly trespassed...
Well, excuse me, Tim, if you could just hang on a second. Let's listen in to the vice president.
I did what I have done my entire career, which is take seriously the oath that I have taken many times to support the Constitution of the United States, which included today performing my constitutional duties to ensure that the people of America, the voters of America, will have their votes counted, that those votes matter, and that they will determine then the outcome of an election. I do believe very strongly that America's democracy is only as strong as our willingness to fight for it. Every single person, their willingness to fight for and respect the importance of our democracy. Otherwise, it is very fragile, and it will not be able to withstand moments of crisis. And today, America's democracy stood.
Madam Vice President, President there making comments after tallying up all the certified votes today, which brings us back, Tim, to 4 years ago. Just let me underscore, you have a right to protest. You know, everyone does, including on January 6th. So my question had been to you, is there anything on that day that you would have done differently or felt like maybe you shouldn't have done, like go into the Capitol or at that time? Give us your take on that, because I think first glance, all of this looks like you were heavily overcharged and over-sentenced if you should have been charged at all. But is there something that you've learned that maybe you wouldn't have done?
Well, again, you know, you actually are hitting on something very important. And that's the principle in law that there should be fair notice that you're actually committing a crime in the first place. So many people who trespassed on Capitol grounds or trespassed within the Capitol didn't know they were committing any crime at all. You'd think it's public grounds and it's a public building. Many people wandered into the Capitol through open doors. They didn't, as I said, break windows open or kick the doors open like some others did. And you also need to remember that the perimeter around the Capitol was torn down by federal informants. So the idea of trespassing, which is a federal statute, I believe it's 1752, those signs were torn down. The fencing was taken down. And so thousands of people poured into an area. And for the most part, they didn't witness any violence. And there was no reason to suspect that there was any criminal action going on. And so it's important to understand there's a lot that's been withheld from the American public. A lot of people have been, as you said, overcharged, and they shouldn't have been charged at all. In criminal law, you have the concept of mens rea. So you have the guilty mind, you have the criminal intent. And if there was no intent to commit a crime, then necessarily the person is innocent. And this is something that Americans haven't really understood. They see violent or nonviolent, felony or misdemeanor in the building or on the grounds. It's totally irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. You have the issue of due process being violated, evidence being withheld, and the most nefarious aspect of this all is the fact that the FBI was there, Antifa members were there, plainclothes Capitol Police, Metro PD, electronic surveillance unit, they were all there. It was a setup. There were agitators and provocateurs, and there were feds, and we know them because we've identified some of them. We know their names. And so this was a setup. I'm sure you've seen the report recently. Where about what they said, 26 confidential
26.
human sources were there. I guarantee you the number is far higher. And so when Donald Trump gets in office and he takes over the Department of Justice, Defense, and Homeland Security, we're going to find out there were far more assets deployed there that day than they would like us to believe. It was a setup, and I know because I've met some of these people.
Well, Tim, we do know that it was the largest investigation that the Department of Justice has ever done. And that over 1,600 people were charged. We know that more than half of them have pleaded guilty, many without knowing how to plead because they were put in a bad position. But what is your take on the reporting from Politico today that the Department of Justice is still scaling up these convictions, that there's 200 more people who will be convicted that were there that day that have been living their lives in peace for the last 4 years? I mean, what do you say to the ongoing kind of witch hunt, it seems like, under Joe Biden's Department of Justice?
Well, it shows you that they are prioritizing convictions, and essentially this is kabuki theater. As my fellow defendant Will Pope adequately or quite aptly predicted quite a while ago, they're sitting on just a bunch of cases at any time they could drop to prosecute. And so the question remains, why are they doing this? And it's clearly just so they can roll out a few cases here or there every week and just make a show of this. There was a man named John Banuelos, the only person there's any evidence of discharging a firearm on January 6th. They waited 3 years to pick him up. And of course, he was known to the feds for 3 years because he was involved in a stabbing murder out in Utah. Why, if it was an armed insurrection, why did the feds wait 3 years to pick up the one man who discharged a firearm? And that's because this is all a setup. They sit on certain cases for narratives and narrative control. And I guarantee you that some of these defendants that could theoretically be charged are possibly burned assets, not necessarily all of them. It's important to understand that, there were a lot of assets there that day. There were people who were blending into the crowd. And I do believe that at the end of the day, when we get the full list of CHSs, we're going to find out that not everybody was who they claimed to be. Now, as you would rightly point out, as you would rightly acknowledge, though, there are old ladies being prosecuted. They have been kicking people's doors in. They raided me with dozens of people. They've been doing morning and midnight raids on people's homes. This is a humanitarian disaster that destroyed families and destroyed lives for largely picketing. And even for those who do have assault charges, you need to understand that the context is the cops attacked them first and they were defending third parties. They saw old ladies getting body slammed with riot shields. And so due process has been denied. There's so much more to the story that meets the eye, and the feds are covering it up. And this is just theater, frankly.
Well, I think a lot of people want to know more. Tim Hale, we appreciate you bringing your perspective and your experience, including 3 years behind bars. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you. God bless.
Seems like this is a Rorschach
You know,
you keep seeing more and more. It moves. People want more information on it to figure it out.
well, I mean, just the fact that the Department of Justice has never undergone a larger investigation than it did on
Than
January
this,
6th shows you the outsized attention that Democrats gave it.
And like he said, a lot of people were in there didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
Look, I think I think it's fair to say maybe you shouldn't go in the building on that day, but I also think that they had the argument, well,
when you have
belongs to
Capitol
everybody.
Police, when you have Capitol Police officers opening the door
I
for you
know.
to enter,
Yeah.
why would you think you were committing a felony? It is the people's
At
house.
the same time, you have other people bashing in windows and doors. I mean, that's why I say it's like a Rorschach test. It's like, what do you see here? And then you launch into a conversation on it. It's very difficult, but I think a lot of people would argue, I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel like people were overcharged, over-sentenced. He's probably a good example. I'm not saying nothing was done wrong, but
just to
that's
walk
a
the
pattern.
halls of Congress and have to spend 3
It's
years,
3 years
behind bars, that
behind
ruins
bars.
families, that ruins families, that ruins lives,
Yeah.
that ruins reputations.
and the reputation of justice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, much more ahead on N2. We'll be right back.